In March 2016, the mountain town of Red Mesa, Colorado, remained the sort of place where disappearance felt improbable. Yet, from this quiet setting emerged one of the region's most perplexing missing persons cases: the sudden vanishing of an 11-year-old child and the man who had raised him for most of his childhood. No confrontation was reported, no emergency was detected, and no distress signal was sent. A normal school day ended with 2 people gone, and no conclusive trace has surfaced since. Red Mesa, a mountain town of roughly 6,000 residents, lived off seasonal tourism and the long-standing timber operations that supported several local families. The crime rate stayed low year after year, and the region's wide-open terrain created the impression that danger, particularly danger involving children, was something that happened elsewhere. Most homes sat on large lots bordered by pine and brush, and people trusted their neighbors enough to let children walk or bike to school without the constant supervision more common in metropolitan areas. That sense of security formed the backdrop against which a far more complicated story would eventually unfold. Within this environment lived Ethan Ward, an 11-year-old 6th grader whose teachers described him as polite, soft-spoken, and noticeably attached to the adults he relied on. He preferred video games and small electronic projects over team sports, and he often looked for reassurance when routines changed. His mother, Melissa Ward, worked irregular shifts as an emergency room nurse in Grand Junction, an hour away. Because she spent long stretches at the hospital, the structure of Ethan's daily life rested largely on the man who had raised him from early childhood. 48-year-old Samuel Brooks, a former airline electronics technician who had stepped away from his job several years earlier. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet man, methodical and reserved, someone who stayed busy with home repairs and who rarely socialized outside a small circle. The relationship between Ethan and Brooks had been forged through years of familiarity. Camping during the summer months, repairing broken gadgets, and small traditions that became part of the boys' sense of home. When Melissa and Brooks separated in 2015, after a long period of emotional distance, the legal decisions that followed reshaped the entire household. A family court granted Melissa full custody, and she moved with Ethan to a smaller apartment closer to town. To adults, the change seemed manageable, but it was clear the child struggled more than expected. School records from early 2015 documented episodes of irritability, difficulty adjusting to the new environment, and signs of emotional stress. Though the move was intended to stabilize the family, it created a split in the boys' loyalties that no one fully understood at the time. What later emerged was the fact that Ethan continued communicating with Brooks in ways his mother did not know. The emails, recovered later by investigators, showed a pattern that only increased with time. Short messages appeared late at night. "I just want to come back home," or "Nothing feels right here." Some notes included promises to be better if he could return to the house where he had grown up. To a trained eye, these were not threats or coded signals of abuse. They reflected a child caught between attachment and change, seeking comfort in the one adult he believed had always provided stability. In the months before the critical date, Ethan had also begun misbehaving at school in ways that teachers described as uncharacteristic. He acted out, left class without permission, and once called emergency services, reporting that Melissa had hit him. Deputies who responded documented no injury and concluded the boy was under stress from family turmoil. Still, the incident highlighted the internal conflict that would shape everything that followed. By early March 2016, the tension surrounding the custody situation became more visible in subtle ways. Ethan's homeroom teacher noted increased distraction. Counselors recommended a full psychological evaluation, but scheduling complications meant it had not yet been completed. Meanwhile, Brooks maintained his routines at the house he once shared with the family. He was not known to violate court restrictions, and there had been no previous attempts to interfere with Melissa's custody. From the outside, the separation appeared settled. From the inside, the emotional dynamics were far more unstable. On the morning of March 14, 2016, an event occurred that investigators later identified as a turning point. Before noon, Brooks delivered a sealed envelope to his attorney in Grand Junction. Inside were financial documents, an inventory of personal belongings, and a short handwritten note whose tone suggested resignation rather than planning. Though it did not explicitly state an intention to harm himself, the phrasing resembled what officers later called a message written for finality. That delivery was the last confirmed action of Brooks before he drove toward Red Mesa. At Red Mesa Middle School, the day proceeded normally. Ethan attended his morning classes, spoke casually with classmates, and followed routine until shortly before lunch, when he requested permission to step outside. The hall monitor documented seeing him walk towards the front exit, and security footage captured a gray SUV slowing at the curb. The boy approached the vehicle without hesitation and entered the passenger seat. The license plate revealed it was Samuel Brooks' car. No alarm was raised because the pickup appeared calm and familiar, and the school had no immediate reason to suspect a violation. By late afternoon, however, when Ethan failed to come home, and Melissa realized no authorized guardian had arranged to collect him, the first cracks appeared in what had seemed an ordinary Monday. Attempts to reach Brooks went unanswered. Ethan's phone had been powered off since lunch. Traffic cameras recorded Brooks' SUV heading south on Highway 141, a route that led away from town, toward the cliffs and narrow trails of Red Canyon. At 5:42 p.m., the vehicle's GPS tracker sent its final signal from a remote location before going offline entirely. Those details formed the earliest pattern of concern. Ethan did not return home. Brooks's phone remained silent. The vehicle stopped communicating only hours after leaving school. When investigators later assembled the sequence, they ended the first section of the report with a line that would define the rest of the case. That was the last time anyone saw Ethan Ward and Samuel Brooks. When Melissa Ward contacted the Mesa County Sheriff's Office shortly after 7 p.m. on March 14, 2016, the information she provided was straightforward but deeply concerning. Her 11-year-old son had not returned from school. She had received no notice of an early pickup, and every attempt to call him had gone straight to voicemail. The deputy who took the report treated it as a high-risk case from the beginning, not because there was evidence of immediate danger, but because of the child's age, the lack of communication, and the fact that the boy had a documented emotional dependency on a non-custodial adult. Those factors together met the criteria for an urgent search. The school confirmed rapidly that Ethan had left campus shortly before lunch. Staff initially assumed he had been collected by a guardian, which was not unusual for students with changing family schedules. Only after Melissa called did administrators understand that no such arrangement had been made. They reviewed their logs and security footage, while deputies arrived to begin gathering statements. It took less than an hour for the name Samuel Brooks to appear as the adult who had collected the child. Officers drove to Brooks's residence on the outskirts of Red Mesa. The house was locked, the lights were off, and no vehicle was present. A neighbor recalled seeing Brooks earlier in the afternoon, packing what appeared to be camping gear into the SUV. That detail was not immediately alarming. Many locals took advantage of early spring weather for day trips into the foothills. But when paired with Melissa's report, it contributed to a picture that needed to be addressed without delay. Authorities entered the house after securing a warrant, taking note of what was missing and what had been left behind. Clothing, tools, and electronic equipment were still in place. The bedroom appeared undisturbed. The only irregularity was the absence of Brooks' personal documents, which were not located that night. Traffic cameras along Highway 141 provided the next meaningful data point. Deputies identified Brooks's SUV traveling south at 3:21 p.m. with a single small figure in the passenger seat. The route led away from populated areas and toward a sparsely monitored region known for deep ravines and sudden drops. Patrol units searched for fresh tire marks, stalled vehicles, or signs of a roadside emergency, but the fading daylight and rugged terrain limited visibility. By the following morning, the search had expanded significantly. Detectives requested aerial assistance, and a helicopter from the State Patrol conducted a preliminary sweep of the Red Canyon region. The flight crew noted the steep cliffs, unstable edges, and dense patches of brush that could conceal a vehicle or campsite from ground teams. Despite several passes, they observed nothing that matched the make or color of Brooks's SUV. At the same time, officers continued to check rest areas, gas stations, and trailheads along the highway, showing photos of the two to commuters and passing truckers. No verifiable sighting emerged. The investigation gained momentum on March 17th when deputies located a makeshift rest area deep within the wooded section off an unmarked service road. Footprints were present, though the soil composition prevented clear impressions. Several items indicated recent use: 2 disposable water bottles, a partly eaten energy bar, and the remains of a fire ring that had not fully cooled. Latent prints lifted from the bottles confirmed that Ethan and Brooks had handled them. The presence of both sets of prints raised more questions than answers. It suggested the pair had not encountered foul play immediately after leaving school, but the site offered no clear direction about where they had gone next. No discarded clothing, no personal belongings, no phone, and no maps were found. Later that afternoon, a friend of Brooks contacted investigators after receiving an unusual text message from an unfamiliar number. The message referenced wolves getting closer and a midnight train, phrases that held metaphorical significance to Brooks' earlier communications about court pressure and his fears of losing influence in Ethan's life. The timing of the message, sent days after the final GPS ping of the SUV, complicated the timeline. Analysts could not immediately determine whether the message reflected an actual threat, a symbolic statement, or an attempt to mislead anyone following the case. Search efforts intensified along the southern edge of Red Canyon as new information arrived from a ranger who believed he had seen a gray SUV speeding along the ridge road at dusk on March 14th. He had not recorded the plate, but the description matched the vehicle in question. According to his recollection, the SUV traveled fast enough to draw his attention, then disappeared around a bend near a cliffside overlook. The terrain in that area was known to be hazardous, with soft edges that could collapse under insufficiently cautious drivers. That report became the first indicator that the situation might involve far more than a custody dispute or voluntary absence. In parallel with field operations, detectives reviewed financial data. Brooks' bank account showed no activity after the morning of March 14th, and his credit cards had not been used. Phone records indicated that both his and Ethan's devices ceased transmitting after midday, an unusual pattern unless the phones had been deliberately turned off or destroyed. Notably, Brooks had not purchased fuel, camping permits, or supplies in the days leading up to the disappearance, which made the presence of a temporary campsite more puzzling. Investigators later theorized that the supplies may have been stored long-term in his garage, though no conclusive evidence supported that assumption. Melissa participated in multiple interviews, providing access to Ethan's computer and email accounts. The history corroborated the long-standing communication between the boy and Brooks, including the child's attempts to reconnect with the man he viewed as a stabilizing figure. Nothing in the exchanges suggested a plan to run away, but the emotional tone made clear that Ethan might have left campus willingly if he believed Brooks intended to help him. The complexity of that relationship influenced how investigators interpreted each new finding. They could not rule out the possibility of mutual cooperation, nor could they dismiss the likelihood that an adult had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable child. By March 18th, the case had shifted from a search for two individuals to an investigation carrying the possibility of fatal outcome. The discovery of the campsite, the abrupt halt of digital footprints, and the report of the fast-moving SUV collectively suggested a trajectory toward the canyon region. The sheriff's office acknowledged the mounting concerns, but emphasized that no single piece of evidence confirmed harm. It remained entirely possible, at least in theory, that the pair had chosen to hide temporarily. That uncertainty marked the end of the initial phase. The investigation now required a different level of analysis, one that would focus not on whether Ethan and Brooks had left Red Mesa voluntarily, but on whether they had ever intended to return. The morning of March 21, 2016, marked the first significant development since the discovery of the temporary campsite. A rancher traveling along a maintenance trail near the lower basin of Red Canyon contacted the sheriff's office after noticing fragments of metallic debris scattered along a shallow stream bed. The color and contour of the pieces suggested they were not remnants of old mining equipment, and the rancher recalled the bulletin seeking information about a missing gray SUV. Deputies reached the scene within the hour, and their early assessment aligned with the caller's suspicion. Several fragments appeared consistent with exterior components of a late-model vehicle. Search teams moved outward from that location, methodically combing through the brush and rock formations. Within a short distance, they located a section of windshield, glass bearing factory markings associated with the same make and model as Samuel Brooks's vehicle. That find prompted the deployment of a second helicopter, this time assigned specifically to survey the vertical walls of the canyon. The pilot flew low, navigating wind shear and narrow turns, until finally reporting what ground crews could not see: the outline of a vehicle resting upside down along a rocky ledge more than 100 meters below the main road. Recovery specialists joined the operation alongside a technical rope team familiar with the terrain. Their initial descent revealed the SUV had sustained extensive structural deformation. The frame had twisted upon impact, the windows were shattered, and the front end had been compressed inward. Despite the damage, the license plate remained intact enough to confirm the vehicle belonged to Brooks. The absence of fire damage suggested the fuel system had not ruptured violently, indicating the SUV had tumbled rather than exploded. What investigators saw inside the wreck introduced the most confounding element of the case. The airbags had deployed, yet both front seats were empty. The rear seating area was crushed beyond recognition, but no biological evidence, no blood, no hair, no fabric remnants, was visible. The debris field contained miscellaneous papers, a broken flashlight, and a few personal items, but nothing that indicated either occupant had been inside the vehicle at the moment it went over the cliff. That observation shifted the investigation away from a presumed accident and toward a question without a clear answer. How had the SUV ended up in the canyon without the people who were supposed to be traveling in it? Specialists conducted a slow examination of the ground above the drop point. Tire impressions trailed toward the cliff's edge, showing a straight trajectory. There were no signs of braking, swerving, or hesitation. The marks indicated steady forward momentum, consistent with a deliberate approach rather than an uncontrolled slide. Soil displacement patterns revealed the underside of the vehicle had scraped the lip of the cliff before falling. The detail that drew the most attention, however, was the presence of a narrow wooden stake planted several paces back from the edge. It had been fashioned from two sticks tied with cord, forming a simple alignment marker. That placement suggested planning. Someone had opted to create a visual reference point leading toward the cliff. Accident reconstruction experts later calculated the approximate speed of the vehicle prior to its descent. Based on the distance traveled through the air and the deformation of the metal, they estimated a minimum velocity of 45 miles per hour. At that speed, no occupant could have safely exited the SUV in the seconds before it reached the drop. Either the vehicle had been unmanned when it launched, or the occupants had exited the car well before it was put into motion. The discovery did not resolve the fate of Ethan Ward or Samuel Brooks. Instead, it amplified the uncertainty. If the vehicle had been intentionally sent over the cliff as a means of staging a fatal crash, investigators needed to determine where the two individuals had gone after abandoning it. That question led search teams to widen their radius. Crews examined animal trails, abandoned mining tracks, and seasonal creek beds for footprints, clothing, or equipment. Trained dogs were brought in, but shifting temperatures and high winds reduced their ability to track human scent. Several hours of coordinated sweeps yielded nothing except the confirmation that the canyon was unforgiving terrain for anyone traveling without preparation. Detectives then reviewed the timeline backward. The campsite found days earlier could not be conclusively linked to the cliff area, but the presence of both individuals' fingerprints there confirmed they had been alive and mobile after leaving Red Mesa. The campsite items showed no signs of distress or urgency, which contradicted the idea of a spontaneous flight into dangerous territory. On the contrary, the site appeared organized and routine, as if they had paused briefly during a planned route. That detail deepened the puzzle. A calm stop followed by a staged crash implied intention, yet the motive behind that intention remained speculative. Attention also turned to the cryptic message sent from the unknown number to Brooks' friend. Investigators explored the possibility that Brooks had been attempting to create the impression of pursuit. The phrasing echoed his earlier descriptions of feeling pressured by the court process and fearing the loss of his parental role. If the message was meant to mislead authorities, it would align with the staged crash hypothesis, but phone analysis showed no clear link between the message source and either missing individual. The lack of correlation raised the possibility that someone else had sent it, although no evidence identified who that person would be or what their connection to the case might have been. While investigators examined the canyon, Melissa worked closely with detectives to provide every available detail about her former husband's habits. She explained that Brooks was familiar with remote terrain and had spent years exploring off-road trails. That knowledge complicated the search strategies, as he could move through areas without leaving obvious signs. Melissa also acknowledged that Ethan had expressed repeated desires to return to Brooks' home, making it plausible the boy had left school willingly. She highlighted, however, that the child would not have understood the risks associated with canyon country. Her statements reinforced the investigators' concern that Ethan had been dependent on the decisions of an adult who appeared increasingly intent on isolating himself. Recovery of the SUV marked a turning point. It eliminated the possibility of a simple accident and established clear evidence of manipulation. Yet the absence of two bodies, coupled with the lack of secondary signs along the canyon floor, prevented investigators from closing the case or declaring either individual deceased. Teams continued to re-examine the vehicle itself, but no fingerprints, footprints, or other traces were found that indicated anyone else had been involved. Every avenue led back to the same unresolved question. Had Brooks orchestrated a disappearance, or had both individuals met an end that left no trace behind? By the time the wreck was hauled from the canyon 5 weeks after its discovery, the case file had already shifted categories. What began as a missing persons search had transformed into an event whose primary evidence, the empty vehicle, raised more contradictions than conclusions. Each detail pointed toward planning, yet none revealed the outcome. The canyon offered no clarity, only a silent backdrop to a disappearance that no accident theory could reasonably explain. The empty SUV forced investigators to re-examine every hour preceding its plunge into Red Canyon. When a missing persons case lacks a body, the timeline often becomes the only structure holding the entire file together. Detectives in Mesa County began reconstructing the days prior to March 14, 2016, with the same rigor typically reserved for homicide cases. Their intention was clear: identify any moment where an irreversible decision might have been made. Records showed that in the days before picking up Ethan from school, Samuel Brooks withdrew a modest sum of cash from his credit union and purchased several standard camping items: water pouches, protein bars, and a compact tarp. These purchases were not unusual for someone who spent time outdoors, yet investigators noted a subtle detail. He made the transactions at small, privately owned stores rather than the larger chain shops he usually frequented. Detectives could not determine whether this reflected intentional avoidance of digital records or simple coincidence, but the observation remained in the case notes. The envelope and letter Brooks delivered to his attorney on the morning of March 14th formed the next point of analysis. The wording contained no explicit declaration of self-harm, yet the tone carried finality. It referenced what is left of his belongings and thanked the attorney for assistance over the years. While not definitive, the phrasing resembled language found in other cases where individuals attempted to sever ties before disappearing. Investigators debated whether such wording should be interpreted as evidence of desperation, premeditation, or an attempt to establish a narrative. The school's security footage marked the clearest moment in the timeline: Ethan leaving campus voluntarily and entering Brooks' vehicle without hesitation. That single act defined the threshold investigators had to cross repeatedly. If Ethan climbed into the SUV willingly, it suggested alignment of intent between the child and the adult. Detectives later noted that willingness did not diminish the risk to the child, but it did shape the psychological profile needed to interpret later events. Once the SUV left the school, the documented movements became sparse. Traffic cameras along Highway 141 captured the vehicle during mid-afternoon, heading south. The footage showed no erratic driving, no indications of a pursuit, and no other vehicles traveling unusually close. After the last camera capture, the SUV's GPS went silent. Cell tower records indicated that both Brooks and Ethan's phones powered off within minutes of each other. That simultaneous termination of signals implied deliberate action. Investigators reviewing the data years later continued to emphasize the point. Two phones do not shut down spontaneously at the same time without cause. The next concrete moment in the timeline came 3 days later, when search teams located the temporary campsite in the national forest. Fingerprints from both individuals appeared on the discarded water bottles and food packaging, confirming their presence at the site after leaving Red Mesa. What struck investigators most was the absence of disorder. Camps belonging to individuals on the run often show haste: items dropped, tools left behind, signs of stress. This one appeared composed. The tarp had been folded before being discarded. There were no signs of a struggle, and no indication that the site had been abandoned suddenly. Such order suggested control rather than panic. Following the discovery of the campsite, investigators relied on digital traces. Email records were subpoenaed, revealing months of communication between Ethan and Brooks. Many of the messages expressed frustration about the custody arrangement, but one particular line stood out to the psychological analyst assisting the team. Weeks before the disappearance, Brooks wrote, "Some situations only end when one side refuses to bend any further." The analyst did not classify it as a threat. Instead, it was recorded as an indicator of rigid thinking, a possible precursor to an extreme decision, combined with the later phrase, "If I vanish, they won't take him," investigators saw the foundation of a mindset pushing toward separation from the legal process. The next key event in the timeline occurred on March 18th, 4 days after the pickup at school. A friend of Brooks received an unusual text containing metaphoric language about being pursued and preparing to leave. Investigators attempted to trace the origin, but could not establish a clear route. The message lacked the structure of a ransom note and did not match Brooks' typical style of communication. This left two possibilities. Either the message was purposely stylized to imply urgency, or it came from someone else with unclear intent. The message remained one of the many uncertainties layered into the case. After March 18th, no confirmed sightings occurred until the vehicle was located in Red Canyon on March 21st. Yet during this interval, two indirect accounts surfaced in later interviews. A driver traveling at dusk along a service road reported seeing a gray SUV moving at an unusually high speed near the canyon area. The witness could not provide a license plate number or identify the driver. Days later, a resident living several miles from the canyon mentioned hearing a loud mechanical noise, possibly an engine revving, though she could not place the exact day. Neither account could be confirmed, but both remained consistent with the possibility that the SUV had been driven deliberately toward the cliff. Once investigators anchored the timeline around the crash site, they examined the logistics of moving unseen through the canyon region. Samuel Brooks had experience navigating remote terrain, yet even a skilled outdoorsman would leave signs: broken branches, disturbed soil, or abandoned materials. None were found. The canyon's geography offered narrow escape routes, but none showed evidence of recent passage. This absence created a contradiction. If Brooks intended to fake a crash and escape, he needed a concealed route. If he intended to end both lives, the empty SUV offered no supporting evidence. The lack of financial activity further complicated the narrative. Neither credit cards nor bank accounts registered use after March 14th. International border databases showed no movement under Brooks's legal name or any known alias. Detectives traced his former employment history and discovered he once traveled under alternate spellings while working in South America, yet those patterns had long ceased. No corresponding travel activity emerged in the months after the disappearance. By early 2017, the timeline had expanded rather than narrowed. New information arrived sporadically, each piece offering potential but no resolution. A woman in Texas claimed to have seen a man and boy resembling Brooks and Ethan at a bus station, though she acknowledged she was not certain. A year later, a former classmate of Ethan reported receiving messages from a gaming account using a nickname only Ethan had used. Digital forensics could not determine whether the account was operated by the missing child or by someone imitating him. Every new lead forced investigators back to the same timeline, one that transitioned from clear, documented movements to a void. The cliff offered no conclusion, the campsite offered no conflict, and the final communications offered no definitive intent. Detectives described the case as a sequence with a beginning, but no visible middle or end. By the time the file was moved into the cold case division, the timeline had become less a tool for progress and more a map of unanswered questions. Each checkpoint remained intact, yet every pathway between them dissolved into uncertainty. The disappearance of Ethan Ward and Samuel Brooks existed within that silence, an outline without a conclusion, surrounded by events that should have clarified their fate, but instead deepened the mystery. By 2021, nearly 5 years after the crash in Red Canyon, the disappearance of Ethan Ward and Samuel Brooks had shifted from an urgent search into a long, unresolved absence. Cold case protocols required periodic reviews, and in this cycle, investigators approached the file with new analytic tools and a broader perspective. They were not looking for a dramatic revelation. They were looking for any structural weakness in earlier conclusions, any overlooked detail capable of altering the trajectory of the case. The decision to renew the search around Red Canyon stemmed from advances in underwater scanning technology. Earlier recovery efforts had been hampered by strong currents, deep pools, and jagged rock formations that could easily conceal objects. Sonar imaging conducted in 2021 allowed teams to map the canyon floor with far greater clarity. Over several days, divers and technicians scanned the region beneath and around the crash site. No remains surfaced, no clothing fragments were detected, and no secondary debris field emerged. The lack of discovery did not rule out death, yet it limited the probability that both individuals had perished close to the site where the vehicle landed. Investigators again confronted the same question that had persisted since 2016. If neither body remained in the canyon, where had they gone? Analysts revisited the mechanical assessment of the SUV's fall. The previous finding, that the vehicle traveled at a speed incompatible with safe exit, remained intact. Tire patterns still suggested a straight, uninterrupted trajectory without braking. The wooden stake positioned several meters behind the cliff edge retained its relevance, viewed by investigators as an improvised landmark, possibly used to align the vehicle's path toward the drop. The consistency of these markers reinforced the likelihood that the descent had been staged. Yet staging did not explain the absence of a departure route, nor did it clarify how two individuals, one of them a child, could have moved away from the canyon without creating traceable evidence. It was during this phase of review that the investigative team revisited the psychological dimensions of the case. Consultations with behavioral specialists framed Brooks as an individual who felt increasingly cornered by the custody dispute. His emails, though not overtly threatening, displayed rigid thinking and a preoccupation with control. Analysts pointed out a recurring theme: the belief that external systems, courts, social services, or even extended family, represented obstacles to a perceived correct outcome. Within such a mindset, extreme solutions could appear rational to the individual, even while contradicting legal or ethical norms. For investigators, the question shifted from whether Brooks intended an irreversible act to how far he was willing to go in order to prevent the possibility of Ethan being permanently separated from him. Parallel to the behavioral review, financial analysts retraced Brooks's monetary history with meticulous attention. The absence of transactions after March 14th was reaffirmed, yet this void itself became a data point. Individuals attempting to vanish typically minimize digital footprints, but continue to rely on some form of support: cash exchanges, fuel purchases, or indirect electronic patterns. Here, there was nothing. If Brooks and Ethan had survived beyond the fall, they did so without engaging in any measurable activity tied to identity, which suggested prior planning or external assistance. Neither scenario could be confirmed. In the same period, investigators examined a new cluster of tips. Most lacked corroboration, but a few carried enough detail to warrant deeper evaluation. One came from a former trucker who believed he had seen a man and a boy matching their description near a rest stop in northern Arizona. His account included specific details about the boy's red backpack, an item Ethan had been known to carry. Yet video footage from the rest stop had long been overwritten, and no physical evidence remained. The sighting was filed as possible but unverified. The most disruptive tip arrived through the Digital Crimes Division. A teenager who had once attended classes with Ethan reported receiving messages from an online gaming account that used a username Ethan had created years earlier. The messages were brief and ambiguous, containing only a greeting and a reference to an inside joke. Digital tracing showed the signal routing through servers outside the country, preventing clear attribution. investigators could not determine whether it originated from Ethan, from an imitator, or from a user who happened to adopt a similar username. The ambiguity yielded more speculation than clarity. Still, investigators noted the timing. Nearly a year after the disappearance, long after public interest had waned. As analysts assembled these elements, they organized them into 3 working scenarios. The first involved a murder-suicide carried out in stages, with the crash intended as the final act. Although the attorney's letter provided a potential emotional backdrop, its vague wording could not be interpreted as definitive. More importantly, the lack of bodies contradicted typical patterns for such cases. Without remains or remnants, the theory lacked the foundation needed for a conclusive determination. The second scenario involved the deliberate staging of both deaths to facilitate long-term disappearance. Investigators found this theory more structurally coherent. The controlled vehicle trajectory, the absence of forensic evidence inside the SUV, and Brooks's previous international work suggested he possessed the knowledge and planning ability required for such an operation. Yet several obstacles persisted. A staged disappearance involving a child requires coordination, resources, and secrecy that extend far beyond one individual. No trace of such coordination emerged. Additionally, the emotional volatility indicated in Ethan's emails suggested he might struggle to maintain long-term silence. The third scenario envisioned an unintended accident or miscalculation followed by an improvised escape. This theory accounted for the possibility that Brooks and Ethan left the vehicle voluntarily before it went over the cliff, perhaps intending to create the illusion of death, but without a fully formed plan for survival afterward. However, investigators found no environmental evidence supporting this sequence. Every path away from the canyon contained opportunities for detection: mud patches, steep inclines, water crossings, yet none revealed footprints, clothing snags, or abandoned supplies. Each scenario illuminated parts of the disappearance, but failed to assemble a complete explanation. Detectives described the case as one where all 3 theories remained structurally possible, but none achieved dominance. The strongest elements pointed toward a staged fall, yet the operational details required for survival after such staging lacked supporting evidence. Conversely, the psychological and circumstantial elements supporting a murder-suicide conflicted with the physical evidence at the canyon. With each attempt to synthesize the data, investigators returned to the same unresolved center. By late 2021, the renewed investigation had narrowed the range of possibilities, but had not yielded a definitive answer. The team's closing report articulated the impasse in measured language. The case trajectory shows signs of deliberate planning, yet the post-event silence and absence of supporting traces limit the ability to affirm any single conclusion. For the Ward family, this meant the same limbo persisted. No confirmation of life, no confirmation of death, only a file that grew increasingly complex as more time passed. The reopened investigation did not solve the disappearance of Ethan and Samuel, but it did reframe it. The question shifted from whether the canyon held answers to whether the truth lay outside Red Mesa entirely. It became a case defined not by what was found, but by what remained conspicuously absent: evidence of survival, evidence of death, or evidence of return. By the time the case file reached the Colorado Coroner's Office in early 2022, the disappearance of Ethan Ward and Samuel Brooks had already carried the traits of legally ambiguous death. The canyon crash, the absence of remains, and the mixture of personal distress and careful planning placed the investigation at a point where criminal, civil, and family law concerns intersected. The coroner's role was not to solve the mystery, but to determine whether the available record supported a declaration of death, and if so, under what statutory category? Yet the evidence, though substantial in volume, remained inconclusive in direction. What unfolded in the hearing room reflected the complexity of trying to apply legal standards to a case built largely on missing pieces. The proceeding began with a methodical reconstruction of the last verified hours of both individuals. Investigators restated the known sequence: Ethan leaving the school grounds with Brooks, the southbound movement captured by traffic cameras on Highway 141, and the eventual failure of the vehicle's GPS signal. The coroner noted that such a sequence would normally fit within the parameters of a suspected fatal event, especially when linked to an abandoned vehicle found in a location where survival was unlikely. However, the central problem persisted. The SUV did not contain bodies, nor did the canyon environment offer signs of human remains. Without that physical endpoint, the classification of death became a legal interpretation rather than a biological certainty. Experts in accident dynamics testified that the SUV had descended the cliff at a speed that would have rendered survival impossible for anyone inside. That point was not contested. What remained in dispute was whether anyone had in fact been inside the vehicle at the moment of its fall. Analysts reiterated their prior conclusion. All indicators suggested the descent was unmanned. The absence of seatbelt marks, blood, hair fibers, or tissue inside the cabin supported that assessment. When the coroner asked whether animals, water flow, or decomposition could fully erase all traces, the forensic team answered that total erasure would be improbable, but not impossible. The canyon environment, with its rapid water movement, abrasive rock beds, and shifting sediment, could degrade biological evidence quickly. Still, the complete lack of any indicator raised procedural hesitation. The coroner recorded the uncertainty as material. The hearing then turned to psychological intent, a sensitive area where legal interpretation must balance professional caution with available documentation. Testimony from family court representatives described Brooks' growing frustration with custody rulings and his increasing fixation on what he saw as the impending loss of Ethan. Email excerpts presented to the court showed patterns of worry, resentment, and a belief that conventional systems had failed him. Yet the emails also showed planning, coherence, and a structured approach to future actions. The coroner noted that such duality, distress on one hand, deliberate preparation on the other, did not neatly support a conclusion of suicide or homicide. Rather, it complicated any attempt to assign motive or classify the endpoint of the disappearance. Civil attorneys for Melissa Ward addressed another dimension: the practical consequences of the legal ambiguity. Without a declaration of death, she could not obtain a death certificate for her son, making it impossible to make decisions related to inheritance, insurance, guardianship, or long-term documentation. She could not even legally close Ethan's educational file. For her former spouse, the question was different but equally entangled. A declaration of Brooks' death would initiate estate transfer processes, dissolve unresolved debts, and close a range of administrative obligations. Without it, all matters remained suspended. The law required clarity, yet clarity remained absent. In parallel, the Mesa County Sheriff's Office presented its own institutional concern. Declaring Ethan and Brooks legally deceased would shift investigative priorities. If the deaths were classified as accidental, the file might be archived permanently. If classified as homicide-suicide, the file could be closed with finality. However, if the coroner refused to declare death, the case would remain in an active but low-priority status, requiring periodic review and keeping resources loosely committed. Law enforcement representatives did not advocate for any specific outcome, but emphasized the operational reality. The decision would shape the long-term handling of the case. During the second week of testimony, a forensic anthropologist addressed a question that had hovered over the file since the earliest days: whether two bodies could realistically remain undiscovered in the vast canyon system for years. She explained that the combination of vertical terrain, intermittent flooding, and deep crevices could conceal remains indefinitely. Bones caught in fissures or transported into inaccessible channels might never be recovered. This assessment left the coroner with a paradox. The possibility of death remained entirely plausible, yet the absence of evidence remained equally plausible. The case rested on two competing forms of uncertainty rather than contrasting facts. One of the more challenging exchanges occurred when the coroner asked investigators whether they believed Brooks had orchestrated a disappearance for both himself and the child. They answered with professional restraint. The staging of the vehicle fall aligned with that theory. The lack of remains aligned with it as well. But the absence of verified sightings, financial activity, or credible communication in the years after the event weakened the theory's long-term viability. The lead detective summarized the dilemma in a single sentence: "The case shows signs of planning, but no signs of continuation." That statement was entered into the record as a reflection of investigative impasse. 7 years after Ethan Ward and Samuel Brooks were last confirmed alive, the case occupies a quiet but persistent place in the institutional memory of Mesa County. It is no longer the focus of daily investigative work, yet it has not fallen into abandonment. The file remains categorized as an active missing persons case with suspected fatal outcome, reviewed periodically to ensure no overlooked lead gains relevance with time or technological advancement. For Melissa Ward, the passage of years has not simplified the absence. She continues to live in the same apartment they shared when Ethan was last in her care, and the room he used remains largely unchanged. The walls still hold the posters he chose. The small handheld game device he carried on weekends rests on the bedside shelf. These objects serve less as memorial items than as anchors, points she returns to when the legal and investigative uncertainty becomes difficult to manage. Without a death certificate, she cannot complete several administrative processes, but she also admits she has never been certain she would request one, even if the option were available. The town of Red Mesa has evolved in ways that obscure the memory of the event for newer residents. Tourism has increased slightly, several older businesses have closed, and people who lived through the period of the disappearance have either relocated or retired. Those who remain rarely bring up the case unless asked directly, and even then, their recollections have softened into general impressions rather than specific details. Local law enforcement notes that this gradual erosion of first-hand memory is one of the natural limitations of long-term missing persons inquiries. Without sustained visibility, peripheral information tends to fade. Within the Sheriff's Department, the case file stands as a reference example of investigative constraints when a disappearance intersects with family conflict, potential staging, and the absence of physical remains. Officers who joined the department after 2020 study it as part of training on custodial disputes and runaway risk assessments. The lead detective, now semi-retired, summarizes the case in a manner that avoids speculation. This file isn't empty. It simply lacks the one detail that would transform every other piece into a coherent chain. The broader impact of the case lies mainly in policy adjustments. Schools in the region have implemented more stringent departure verification procedures, requiring explicit dual confirmation for any student leaving campus during the day. The county also strengthened documentation requirements in custody disputes, aiming to reduce opportunities for misinterpretation or unilateral action by non-custodial guardians. As for the search itself, no new credible sighting has been recorded in several years. Occasional claims arise, someone resembling Ethan seen in a border town, a message online matching an old username, but none withstands verification. The sheriff's office maintains a steady stance. Until remains are found or a confirmed sighting is documented, the case will remain open. Standing at the edge of Red Canyon today offers no new answers. The terrain is unchanged. The silence is the same. The question that endures is not why the case grew so complex, nor even how the SUV reached the canyon floor. The unresolved point remains the same as on the first evening. By what sequence of choices or events did two people vanish, so completely, leaving behind a trail that stops abruptly at the edge of a cliff, but never explains what came after? If this case held your attention, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts below. Long unsolved investigations often shift when someone remembers a detail that once seemed unimportant. And tell me, where are you watching from? Your answer helps show how far this unanswered story has traveled beyond Red Mesa.